everybody, it is a brand new month, so you know what that means. I need to tell you about all the books I read last month. Last month was a really good reading month for me. I managed to be really consistent about finding time to read every single day, which meant that I got through a good number of books. I read 16 books in the month of May, and I'm going to tell you my thoughts on them. So I have my drink, I have my notes, so let's get started. Before I go into each and every single book and share my thoughts and give a rating, I just want to do a very quick, brief rundown of the stats, which I get through StoryGraph. Not sponsored, I just love the app. I'm forever a Goodreads hater, StoryGraph lover. I just find the stats really interesting. If you don't, feel free to skip. So like I said, I read 16 books in the month of May. Those books added up to being 5,478 pages, and my three top moods for the books were dark, tense and mysterious. So don't know what that says about me, but you can read into that what you will. Pace wise, the majority, 71% of the books I read were medium pace, then fast pace 21%, and then slow pace 7%. I just don't have the time to be wasting on these slow paced books. I need constant excitement. 63% of the books that I read were between 300 and 499 pages, 25% were less than 300, and 13% were over 500 pages. In terms of fiction, non-fiction split, 75%, so 3/4 of the books I read were fiction, and then the other quarter, 25% were non-fiction. I do like to try and get a bit of a mix in there. Some of the non-fiction books I read this month weren't that serious, which you'll see later on, but still. Then three top genres were thriller, horror and crime, which, yeah, that's pretty much everything I kind of like. And last but not least is sort of the formats of digital versus physical book. Normally I tend to read the majority of my books on my Kindle just because it saves space and money, but this month I was in a bit of a physical resurgence, so 75% of the books I read this month were physical, 25% were on my Kindle. So again, very brief stats rundown if that's your sort of thing, but now let's actually talk about the books. I'll go through them in the order that I finished them. My rating system, by the way, is kind of a mess. I don't really know exactly what goes into it. First of all, I do use quarter ratings, like I said, StoryGraph girl, and they use quarter ratings. Also, the ratings themselves are more about how much I enjoyed the book rather than, you know, how well written I thought the book was. A lot of the time, if the book was badly written, I won't enjoy it as much. It's kind of reflected there, but you might be wondering how some books are both 4 stars when one of them is clearly written better. It's just based on how much I enjoy it. It's not that serious. And again, I rate based on the genre that it's in. So a 4-star horror book will look very different from a 4-star, say, literary fiction book. But now that those bases are covered, let's dive into it. The very first book that I finished in May is Fairy Tale by Stephen King. This is about a teenager named Charlie who lives in rural Illinois, USA. One day he's going home from school or to school, I can't really remember, and he hears his neighbour's dog Radar barking like mad. He follows the sound and then finds out that Mr. Bowditch, his neighbour, has fallen off of a ladder and has broken his leg and can't move. So he calls the ambulance for them to help him, and then because of various things in his past, which it'll go into in the book, he feels sort of this obligation to look after Mr. Bowditch. So while Mr. Bowditch is in the hospital, he takes care of Radar, the German Shepherd, and also does some maintenance around his property. And then once Mr. Bowditch can leave the hospital, he also helps him out as well around the house. One day Mr. Bowditch dies, not spoiler, it's on the back of the book, and he leaves Charlie sort of these tapes because Radar is an old dog, she's getting quite sickly, not got much time left, but he leaves the tape saying, by the way, there's a portal to a secret world hidden in my shed. If you go down there, you'll find something that turns Radar, you know, back to being healthy again. But there's loads of danger down there. So Charlie decides to go down into this other world regardless to save Radar. And then, as Mr. Bowditch said, a lot of not very nice nonsense is going down there and Charlie has to save the day. I did enjoy this book. I did think that the first half was better than the second half. That might just be because the fantasy aspect sort of ramped up in the second half, and fantasy's not my favourite genre, so that could be playing a part. There are also some bits that are a bit slower than the rest that I find my interest dipping, but I still did enjoy the book. I gave it 4 stars. I would recommend it. I was kind of, I say forced, not really. That makes it sound like I was like tied up and made to read the book. But my wife recommended I read it because I was kind of a bit hesitant to read it because it was more fantasy based, but I still enjoyed it and I gave it 4 stars. Up next was the first non-fiction book, which is 1411 QI Facts to Knock You Sideways. QI is like a British panel show that talks about fun facts and general knowledge, trivia, and this is a book of facts that they put together, 1411 of them to be precise. These are the kind of books I just have lying around, and every now and then I'll flick through pages and read a couple of facts. For example, most Britons say sorry almost 2 million times in their lives, or Martian sunsets are blue. The thing I like about this fact book is it doesn't like go into loads and loads of, you know, like all the sources and the studies and things behind everything. What they do is they just give you the bare facts, and then they have a website that links to the book where you can look up the fact and it will give you all their sources. So yeah, I can't really rate this book because it's just a fun book of facts. Next on the list, another Stephen King. This is Desperation. This is one part of a kind of 2-part book series, not really, they're like pairs of books, wherein Stephen King wrote sort of a same basic plot with the same basic characters, but one was under his name and one was under his pseudonym Richard Bachman. So there was the same protagonist and antagonist, but written from the perspective of 2 different authors, so the story plays out in different ways. In this book, Desperation is sort of an old mining town in Nevada, and there was this old mine that collapsed many years ago and trapped lots of miners inside, and then they died. The mine was shut down, but recently a new company's opened the mine and are excavating it again. The old mine becomes uncovered, and you know, this demonic spirit escapes when they open up the mine, and it possesses people in town to do its bidding. The main protagonist is this little boy. I can't exactly remember his name because both books have the same characters, but they're kind of different, and I'll mix it up. But he sort of, again, because of an experience that he's had in his past, he's sort of got this fascination with God and religion. He uses God to defeat this evil entity, Tak. It was a good book, it was enjoyable. It's over like 700 pages long, this book, but it didn't feel like it was that long. It did sort of, I did fly through it in a couple of days. So it was really fast paced. It was one of the more gory Stephen King books that I've read. Like, there are some pretty gruesome scenes in this, which I enjoyed. In the end, I gave it 4.25 stars. I did enjoy it. Again, the first half I think was better than the second half, but again, 4.25 is still a really high mark. Then we had Max Verstappen, Born to Race, a biography by James Gray. See, Max Verstappen is the current reigning F1 world champion. I really like him, I'm a fan. It's just a basic biography sort of that goes through Max's junior career, his childhood, and then his rise through Formula One. It was alright, it wasn't the best. Obviously Max is quite young, so he's not got that much of a story to tell, but even then, this didn't feel that in depth. And in fact, it's a very short book, but a lot of the chapters were taken up talking about his dad and like the random history of other Formula One race tracks, so it wasn't too much about Max himself. Despite that though, there was still some interesting tidbits that I learned and some nice photographs, so I gave this 3 stars. It wasn't the best biography I've ever read, and it did leave me feeling like I wanted a bit more information about Max himself, because that was the purpose of the book. Then the next book that I read is a book that I had from the library, so I don't have it anymore, but it's On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft by Stephen King. This is part memoir, part instructional guide for wannabe writers. The reason why I picked this up was for the memoir parts, but I ended up really enjoying the instructional parts about writing when he gave his tips and tricks. I don't want to be a writer, I'm not very good at it, but I still find those equally as fascinating as the memoir sections. And he did get quite vulnerable in the book and talked about his experiences with drug and alcohol dependency, as well as his recovery from a tragic car accident that he got into in like early 2000s. It was really good insight to see what his writing process was and his thoughts on some of the books that he's published. So I gave this 4.5 stars. I would highly recommend reading this even if you aren't interested in writing yourself. The next book I read was The Long Walk by Stephen King, writing as Richard Bachman, his pseudonym. The Long Walk is set in a sort of dystopian America where every single year there's this competitions held where boys aged 13 to 17, I think it is, can enter to take part in The Long Walk, which is an ultra endurance competition where they have to keep walking at a steady pace without stopping. If they get 3 warnings, then they're eliminated, and by eliminated, you know, you're done. But there's no finish line, it's just whenever it's the last one standing, they win. I did really enjoy this. Obviously it gave Hunger Games energy, but before Hunger Games was ever a thing. It's a weird book because it felt like not a lot happened and a lot happened at the same time, which I don't really know how to explain, but that's just what it felt like. I did enjoy this book. I gave it 4 stars purely because I wish more of the questions that I had were answered. Like, we never really found out what steps led us to get to this dystopian point. We don't really know why the long walk was started. We don't really know like the motivation behind it, and I just wish a lot more of that was actually explained and, you know, we had a nice resolution. But side note, I recently found out that they're making a screen adaptation of The Long Walk, which they're starting to shoot this year, and I'm very excited for that. Next, we have a book so good that I bought it twice. This is the first book in the Tom Ripley series. It is The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. Tom Ripley is like the ultimate unreliable narrator. He's like paranoid, obsessive, narcissistic, but also just really, really interesting. Like, you kind of forget that he's a bad guy that's doing bad things because you're on his side. At least I was. Maybe I'm also all of those terrible things I just listed. But essentially, from one way or another, he manages to blag a free trip to Europe, essentially, and he spends some time with this guy, Dickie Greenleaf. He really likes the lifestyle, but then it sort of gets threatened and he's worried about having to go home. So rather than, you know, having to make his own way in life, he just decides to kill Dickie and take over his identity. Very good book. He gets into a whole lot of shenanigans. I would highly recommend. Lots of twists and turns. Just exquisite writing. I gave this one 5 stars. So The Talented Mr. Ripley was an amazing book. Next up we have The Cliff House by Chris Brookmyre. This one is also a book. Not a good one though. I gave this one 2 stars and I was incredibly disappointed with it because I've read stuff by this author before and really loved it. I thought it was like witty, unique, like just something new. And this just felt really like derivative and done to death. There was none of his classic wit or charm. It was just all very flat, essentially. There's a hen dude that's getting hosted on this private island, and for some reason, which, you know, doesn't make any sense, she decided to invite a load of people that hate her, because of course you would. And all of the people on the island have deep, dark secrets, and then there's this guy that kidnaps one of the people on the island and says, if the person with the secret doesn't admit their secret, I'm gonna kill them. But he doesn't say who he's after, so then they're all worried that the secret's about them, so they try and like find this person that's being kidnapped while all worrying that they don't want to have to give up their secrets. Side note, when they actually get to the point where they release their secrets, like some of them are very low stakes compared to the others, and you're like, why on earth were you so worried about sharing this? Like, it doesn't matter. There was multiple POVs in this book, and every single chapter, like, it had a heading to let you know who was speaking, and thank God they did that, because otherwise you'd have no idea, because all of the women in this book were written the exact same. They were all whiny, annoying, like one-dimensional. Like, this is peak man writing woman terribly. It was just boring, was the biggest thing. This is the only time I've tabbed a fiction book. And the tabs aren't for good things. The tabs are for bits where I was like cringing so hard that I nearly had to put down the book to like walk away. I still did give it 2 stars, which is maybe too nice, but the second half did kind of pick up and I was still like interested and I was slightly enjoying it. But I will not be reading this again, and I'm probably going to donate it very quickly. So this was The Cliff House by Chris Brookmyre. Next up I had Lord Edgware Dies by Agatha Christie. This is number whatever in the Hercule Poirot series. In this book, Lord Edgware dies. Shocker, I know, sorry to be the bearer of bad news. And Poirot is enlisted to help track down the culprit. Some of the suspects include like his estranged wife, who's an actress, her new boy toy, her actor friend. There's like mistaken identity and random stuff. To be honest, a lot of the Poirot books, other than like the standout great ones, sort of all blend together. But I still did enjoy this book. As per usual, there's a lot of Agatha Christie twists and turns, which kept me on my seat. The one thing that really let this book down is something that lets down a lot of the Poirot books, in that it has blimmin' Captain Hastings in it. I hate Captain Hastings. Whenever he's narrating a book, you know it's never going to be anywhere as good as the ones that he's not narrating. He's just whiny and annoying and has a big opinion of himself but never backs it up. Like, he thinks he's God's greatest gift to the planet, but unlike Poirot, who's also a bit of an egomaniac, like, Hastings absolutely does not do anything to deserve thinking that he's all that at all. I gave this one 4 stars. It was still a good Agatha Christie book, even though it's not one of my favourites in the series that I've read so far. And now we have the second of those 2-parters that I mentioned earlier. This one is The Regulators by Stephen King, but this is the one that he wrote as Richard Bachman. So as I mentioned, it's got the same cast of characters, both good and bad, as Desperation. But in this one, the main setting is this quiet suburban neighbourhood. And in this version, Tack, rather than sort of possessing multiple people in this town, he's actually attached himself to this autistic boy that lives in his aunt's and uncle's house and uses sort of the child's imagination and favourite things to sort of cause havoc in this neighbourhood. The main difference in this book and Desperation is, whilst in Desperation they use the power of God to defeat the evil, in this one they use the power of laxatives, and I'm not joking, that is a big part of the plot in this. This one did feel a bit sillier than Desperation. It's not as graphic as Desperation, and it is quite a bit shorter. I didn't enjoy this as much as Desperation, but it was still a good book. I gave it 3.75 stars. So kind of the uglier sister to Desperation. And then we have the classic Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. I have this gorgeous Folio Society edition. This was already off to a great start because Captain Hastings is nowhere to be seen. So instantly you probably add like at least half a star for that whenever you're in a Poirot book and Captain Hastings is nowhere to be seen. You probably all know the plot of this already. It's been adapted many times. Essentially, they're on this overnight sleeper train. It gets snowed in, guy gets murdered, secrets come out from his past, and it turns out that there's a lot of people on the train that could have a motive. So Poirot's job is to work out which one of them killed him. I wish I hadn't seen the film before I read this book, because whilst the ending of this book was still spectacular, it would have hit so much better if I'd gone into this blind. Like, when this was published originally, I imagine all these old ladies that went to read this book like fainted at the end from the shock, because it was just absolutely wild. So even if you have watched the film, I would recommend reading this book. But yeah, I really enjoyed this mystery. It was quite fun. Even though I had watched the film, I still found it really enjoyable. So I would recommend giving this a read. I gave this 5 stars. It is one of my favourite Poirot books to date. The other one being Murder of Roger Ackroyd, but this is sort of just behind that, but still 5 star. I'm not going to waste too much time talking about this next one because I did make a full review of that, so I'll link that if you do want to watch that. But this is Stephen King's brand new collection of 15 short stories, You Like It Darker. Really good selection. I gave this 4.5 stars. We're getting close to the end now, I promise, and this next book is one that I put off reading for a long time and I have no idea why. I thought it wouldn't be something I was interested in, but I'm so glad I gave it a go because I loved it. It is Yellowface by R.F Kuang. You've probably all know the plot of this already because this was like absolutely everywhere. But essentially the main character is June. She's a not very successful author who is friends with a very successful author, and one night she's over at her friend's house, her friend dies, and before the ambulance arrives, she sort of sneaks into her bag an unpublished manuscript from the successful author, but she doesn't plan to publish it, and then very quickly publishes it. And then a whole load of shenanigans start happening because people accuse her of stealing the book, which she did, and she's trying to rush to make sure her web of lies doesn't all coming down. The narrator in this book really reminds me, I'm not sure if you've seen that woman on TikTok that makes videos with the character, the worst woman you've ever met. That's her. But I loved it. Like, I absolutely hated the main character, but you're supposed to. Every single time I ended a chapter, I'd end it thinking, oh, there's no way she can make this worse for herself, and there's no way she could make me hate her more. And then I would start the next chapter and it would just be her explaining how she made it worse for herself, and then I'd hate her even more. Like, this is the most fun I've had hating a character in a book. The plot of this book kind of like brings to life the fuck around and find out sort of train of thought, and she fucked around a lot I do wish she would have found out a bit more, which is the only reason I gave this 4.75 stars rather than 5 stars. I just think she got off a bit easy in the end. Next up, I have The Sentence by Christina Dalcher. This is one that caught my eye in the library and I decided to give it a go because the premise sounded really good. It's sort of speculative fiction and it's in a world where America are trying to pretty much get rid of the death penalty, but they still want to have it there as an option for serious cases. So what they do is the death penalty is allowed. However, if it turns out that the person that's executed is later proven to be innocent, the prosecutor that asked for the death penalty would be executed instead, as sort of retribution. Which is an interesting premise. Unfortunately, the execution did let it down on multiple points. First of all, the character work wasn't very good. Like, I didn't care about anyone in this book at all, so anything that was happening to them, I was indifferent. Second of all, like, the plot doesn't make too much sense because the main character, who's the lawyer, who is essentially, she's put someone on death row who's now been executed, and now that he's dead, new evidence has come to light to show that he could have been innocent. So obviously she's worried that now she's gonna get executed because this guy's innocent, and she's got to weigh up her desire to live and her passion for justice. Which is all well and good until you realise that there's absolutely no way that she'd have picked the death penalty for this guy. The author tries to explain it as, oh, it was a really bad crime and she was grieving at the time, which is why she did it. But it says explicitly in this book that this is not the worst crime that she's ever tried, so that doesn't make sense. Also, like, yeah, she was grieving at the time because her husband died, but that doesn't make sense when you find out that the prosecutor that you're following is one of the people that, like, started the organisation that wants to get rid of the death penalty and spent years trying to get rid of the death penalty. So it makes no sense that she'd do a 180 and send this guy to the electric chair just because her husband died. I do not buy it at all. So then everything else, you're like, okay, well, this wouldn't have happened. I also really didn't care about the main character because they kept being loads of, like, flashback scenes to when she met her late husband, and in every single one of those flashback scenes he did stuff that just made him the most pretentious, condescending douchebag. So I hated him, and then I didn't like her because, like, well, clearly you have terrible judgment because you chose to marry this guy. You shouldn't have been let to be allowed anywhere near a courtroom if these are the kind of terrible decisions you're making. So anyway, I did give this 3 stars because I still enjoyed it. Like, it wasn't a bad book, and 3 stars is kind of my average book. So it is a bit of a shame because this premise could have been done such better justice if it was written by a better author, maybe. Then next one, this is 1234 QI facts to leave you speechless. Just copy and paste the stuff I said from the first fact book. And the very last book that I finished in May was actually a book that was recommended to me by someone on YouTube. It was recommended by Bonnie Nicole Wright. Thank you very much for recommending me this book. I did enjoy it. It is The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. This book is set in America, in the South, in sort of late 80s, early 90s. There's this group of housewives that have a book club where they read true crime and horror books. One day, this mysterious, handsome stranger moves into their little quiet neighbourhood and things quickly start to get weird. And Patricia, the main character, starts suspecting James, the stranger, of being up to no good, pretty much. And she's trying to convince everyone else around her that he's a bad guy. So I did enjoy this book, and when I first started reading it, I thought it was going to be rated higher than I ended up rating it. But there was a couple of issues that kind of stuck with me and brought down that rating over time. First of all, from the title, I thought this was going to be a lot more whimsical and comedic. There was some comedic moments at the start, and then it was just kind of serious for the rest of the time. There was a lot of, like, darker subjects that I didn't think it was going to touch upon. When it did, I would recommend maybe reading trigger warnings before you start reading this book. So that was the first thing. It probably wasn't exactly everything that I was expecting it to be. Second, every single man in this book is, like, blood-boilingly irritating. A lot of them are downright abusive, and every single time one of them is, I was about to say on screen, on the page, it makes me want to, like, hit myself in the head. They were so annoying, and yes, like, the main bad guy got his comeuppance at the end of the book, but But there was a lot of other men in this book that deserved very similar treatment and they kind of got let off scot-free. So that was the first annoying thing. The next was that the ending was a little bit underwhelming in general. Like Patricia, the main character, like she went through a lot of bad stuff for years because of this guy and nobody believing her. And yeah, like I said, the bad guy got what was coming to him in the end, but there wasn't much justice for Patricia or the other women. So you're like, okay, great, but I kind of wanted more from this ending. The author tried to touch upon racial and gender inequality issues, but they kind of felt half-baked and sort of half-assed, like it didn't feel like it was genuine and they weren't really resolved. And then the last choice that the author made, which was really weird because it had literally absolutely nothing to do with the plot, so I have no idea why he dedicated a lot of this book to talking about how obsessed Patricia's son was with Nazis. Like so many Nazi facts, so much talk about Nazis, a lot of it in like a pretty positive light, which was weird. And it had nothing to do with the plot and it was never resolved. It was just, oh, like there was this running bit throughout the book that the son liked Nazis. And you're like, this really could have been cut out because it was just not necessary and it just was weird. So all those things made me give it 3.5 stars. Like I said, I did enjoy it, but there were those oddities and annoyances that brought it down. But that was everything that I read in May. Please tell me what books you read this month down in the comments. Please like and subscribe. And if you're wanting to see what I'm reading in June, please feel free to watch the video that I made where my cat Ted picks some of the books that I'll be reading in June. And I will see you next time. Bye bye.